I never thought my 35th wedding anniversary would end with me standing in front of a room full of people, revealing that I owned the very company my husband had built his identity around for the past 2 decades. But life has a way of pushing you toward moments of truth, doesn't it? Those pivotal seconds where years of quiet sacrifice and silent knowledge finally burst into the open. The look on Richard's face that night, shock dissolving into understanding, then fear, is something I'll carry with me forever. Not with bitterness, but as a reminder of my own worth, my own power. A reminder that sometimes you need to lose everything to remember who you truly are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should start at the beginning, shouldn't I? My name is Eleanor Matthews. I'm 63 years old now, with silver-streaked hair I no longer dye and smile lines I've earned through both joy and pain. Back when I met Richard, I was just 25, working as an accountant at a small firm in Chicago, dreams as practical as my sensible shoes. Richard was different, all charisma and ambitious energy, with plans that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable when he described them. "We're going to build something magnificent together, Ellie," he'd say, eyes bright with certainty. I believed him. I believed in him. The early years were beautiful in their simplicity. We lived in a tiny apartment where you could hear the neighbors arguing through the walls, but we didn't care. I continued working while Richard launched his first business venture, a small tech consultancy called Matthews Solutions. I remember the night he came home with our first client contract, how we celebrated with a bottle of wine that cost more than our dinner budget for the week. "This is just the beginning," he promised. And he was right. As Matthews Solutions grew, so did our life together. We moved to a modest house in the suburbs, had our daughter, Claire. I reduced my hours at the firm to help Richard with the company books, offering financial advice that he valued. "You've always had the brains in this operation," he'd joke, kissing my forehead. But even then, I could see how he thrived in the spotlight, how he enjoyed being the face of our growing success. When Claire was 7, I discovered I was pregnant again. Our son, Adam, was born with a heart condition that required multiple surgeries. Those were dark, frightening years. I left my job completely to care for him, while Richard threw himself into expanding the business. "I'm doing this for us," he'd explain during the rare dinners when he made it home before the children's bedtime. "For Adam's medical bills, for Claire's future." I understood. I supported him. I managed our home, our children's lives, their education and health care and emotional well-being. And in quiet moments, usually late at night while everyone slept, I studied business management, investment strategies, market trends. Knowledge was my anchor during uncertain times, my silent companion when Richard was absent. When Adam was finally healthy and both children were in school full-time, Richard surprised me. "You've sacrificed so much," he said over a rare, quiet dinner. "The business is stable now. You could go back to your career if you want." But a decade had passed since I'd worked as an accountant. The industry had changed. Instead, I suggested investing some of our savings, making our money work for us while I figured out my next step. Richard trusted my judgment in financial matters, always had. He signed the necessary paperwork without reading the details. "You handle it, Ellie." Numbers make my head spin. That was my first real step toward financial independence, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I simply saw opportunities where Richard saw complications. I moved carefully, thoughtfully, gradually building a portfolio of investments separate from the business. By our 20th anniversary, Matthews Solutions had transformed into Matthews Tech Enterprises, with over 200 employees and contracts throughout the Midwest. Richard was rarely home, always traveling for business development. Our anniversary dinner that year was at an upscale restaurant surrounded by his executives and their spouses. I wore a blue dress he'd sent to the house with a note. For my beautiful wife who makes everything possible. The dress was a size too small. The gesture felt hollow. That night, driving home while Richard responded to emails in the passenger seat, I asked quietly, "Are you happy, Richard? With our life together?" He glanced up, surprised. "Of course. We have everything we ever wanted." Then he returned to his phone. But I wasn't asking about material success. The question lingering in my mind remained unspoken. "Do you still see me?" As our children grew into their own lives, Claire pursuing law in New York, Adam studying medicine in Boston, our house grew quieter. The spaces between Richard and me widened. We became polite strangers sharing morning coffee, occasional dinner companions with practiced conversation. I buried myself in managing our investments, which had grown substantially thanks to some careful decisions and fortunate timing. For our 30th anniversary, Richard was overseas closing a major acquisition. He sent flowers and called briefly between meetings. I spent the evening reviewing property listings and made my first significant purchase without consulting him. A commercial building in downtown Chicago that housed a promising tech startup. When I mentioned it months later, Richard nodded absently. "Whatever makes you happy, Ellie." He didn't ask about the details. He never did. The subtle shift in our marriage might have continued indefinitely, this quiet drifting apart, if not for Melissa Davis. She joined Matthews Tech as the new marketing director when I was 58. I met her at the company holiday party, tall, poised, brilliant, and 37 years old. I watched how she laughed at Richard's jokes, how her hand lingered on his arm. I observed my husband's response, the straightened posture, the renewed energy in his voice. I wasn't naive. I recognized the signs. But confrontation had never been my approach to problems. Instead, I accelerated plans I'd been contemplating for years. I liquidated certain investments and, using a corporate entity I'd established years earlier, began acquiring shares in Matthews Tech Enterprises through various channels. The company had gone public 5 years prior, with Richard maintaining controlling interest. Or so he believed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What my husband failed to understand, what he'd always underestimated, was my thorough comprehension of financial systems and corporate structures. While he focused on expansion and innovation, I methodically, legally, and quietly increased my ownership stake in the company he considered exclusively his achievement. I didn't act out of malice. I acted out of self-preservation, and perhaps out of a desire to finally be seen. The changes in Richard became more obvious. Late nights. Weekend strategy sessions. A renewed attention to his appearance. New cologne. The classic signs that even smart men think are subtle. I said nothing, but I watched. I noted how often Melissa's name appeared in his conversations, how his voice changed when he mentioned her innovative approaches and fresh perspective. I hired a private investigator 3 months before our 35th anniversary. His report, delivered in a plain manila envelope, contained exactly what I expected. Photos of dinner dates, hotel meetings, intimate moments they thought were private. I didn't cry when I saw them. I felt oddly calm, as if witnessing the inevitable conclusion of a story I'd been reading for years. 2 weeks before our anniversary, Richard called with what he considered wonderful news. "I want to host a major celebration for us, Ellie. 35 years deserves recognition. I'm inviting everyone. Executives, major clients, old friends. I've booked the grand ballroom at the Peninsula." "That sounds lovely," I replied, thinking of the paperwork finalizing in my lawyer's office that very moment. The documents confirming my 51% ownership of Matthews Tech Enterprises. I spent those 2 weeks preparing methodically. I updated my will. I had frank conversations with Claire and Adam about their father's likely affair and my planned response. They were upset but supportive. "You deserve better, Mom," Claire said fiercely. "You always have." I selected my outfit carefully for the anniversary celebration, a tailored crimson suit that communicated authority, not flirtation or supplication. I had my hair professionally styled, my makeup applied to accentuate rather than conceal my age. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman of experience, intelligence, and quiet determination. The peninsula's grand ballroom was transformed for the occasion. Cream and silver decorations, champagne flowing freely, a string quartet playing in the corner. Nearly 300 guests mingled and congratulated us on our marital longevity. Richard worked the room masterfully, his arm around my waist when appropriate, then disappearing to greet important clients. I wasn't surprised when Melissa arrived. She wore midnight blue, elegant and understated. What did surprise me was Richard's boldness. After ensuring I was engaged in conversation with the wife of a business associate, he escorted Melissa to a table near the front, personally bringing her champagne, leaning close to whisper comments. That made her laugh. The business associate's wife, Barbara, I believe, followed my gaze and squeezed my arm sympathetically. "Men can be such fools," she murmured, "especially successful ones." I smiled. "Yes, they often mistake silence for ignorance." At 9 o'clock, Richard tapped his glass for attention. The room quieted as he moved to the small stage where the band had been playing. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, confident as he surveyed the crowd. My husband of 35 years, a stranger I knew intimately. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate an extraordinary milestone with Ellie and me," he began, his voice warm with practiced sincerity. 35 years of partnership, of building a life and a legacy together. He spoke for several minutes about our history, our children's accomplishments, the growth of Matthews Tech from a small consultancy to an industry leader. Not once did he acknowledge my contributions beyond support and belief in his vision. The narrative he presented positioned me as a beneficiary of his success rather than a collaborator in its creation. "And now," he concluded, "I have a special announcement that makes this anniversary even more significant. Today, Matthews Tech Enterprises signed the final paperwork to acquire Davis Innovation Group, bringing their cutting-edge marketing technology under our umbrella. This represents the beginning of an exciting new chapter for our company." Davis Innovation Group, Melissa's former company, which she had apparently sold to Richard. The room applauded as Richard gestured for Melissa to join him on stage. She moved gracefully forward, professional, but with an unmistakable intimacy in how she stood beside him. "Melissa Davis will be joining our executive leadership team as Chief Innovation Officer," Richard announced proudly. "Her vision aligns perfectly with where we're taking Matthews Tech in the next decade." More applause. Richard turned toward me, extending his hand in invitation. "Ellie, would you like to say a few words on our special night?" It was the opening I needed, though not one he intended to provide. I rose slowly, deliberately, and made my way to the stage. I accepted Richard's hand but didn't stand beside him as expected. Instead, I positioned myself at the center of the small platform, subtly shifting both him and Melissa to the periphery. "Thank you, Richard," I said into the microphone, my voice steady. "And thank you all for being here tonight. 35 years is indeed a significant milestone, one that invites reflection on the journey taken and the path ahead." I gazed out at the assembled guests, business associates who knew only Richard's version of our story, friends who had watched our marriage evolve from different perspectives, employees whose livelihoods were connected to decisions made in boardrooms. I had never officially entered. When Richard and I met, we had nothing but ambition and trust in each other. Over the decades, one of those elements has flourished while the other has withered. Tonight has made that abundantly clear. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard stepped forward, placing a cautionary hand on my arm. "Ellie, perhaps this isn't..." I continued as if he hadn't spoken. Richard mentioned the exciting acquisition of Davis Innovation Group. What he failed to mention is his personal relationship with its founder. I turned slightly toward Melissa, whose composed expression had frozen into a mask. A relationship that extends well beyond professional boundaries. The room fell completely silent. I could feel Richard tensing beside me, preparing to intervene, to control the narrative as he always did. But I wasn't finished. However, that's not actually the announcement I came prepared to make tonight. I reached into my clutch and removed a folded document, opening it deliberately. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Matthews Tech Enterprises, with 51% ownership of all company assets and voting rights. The shock in the room was palpable. Richard's face transformed from confusion to disbelief to anger in rapid succession. "That's impossible," he hissed, no longer concerned with appearances. "I've been investing in your company for the past 15 years, Richard. Legally, methodically, and completely within my rights. The paperwork is finalized and filed. My first act as majority owner is to call for an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to discuss recent acquisition decisions and executive leadership changes." I turned fully toward him now, speaking not as his wife, but as his superior. In the corporate hierarchy he valued above our marriage. "Your presence is required, of course, as is yours, Ms. Davis, though in what capacity remains to be determined." Melissa had the grace to look uncomfortable. Richard looked shattered, his professional persona crumbling before the very people whose respect he had cultivated for decades. He reached for the microphone, but I maintained my grip. "To our guests, please enjoy the remainder of the evening. The celebration will continue as planned. After 35 years, I've learned that endings and beginnings often occur simultaneously." I handed the microphone to the stunned event coordinator and stepped off the stage. The room remained silent for several long seconds before erupting into hushed conversations. I moved calmly through the crowd toward the exit, accepting brief commiserations and wide-eyed congratulations with equal composure. Richard caught up with me near the door, gripping my elbow and pulling me into a quiet alcove. His face was flushed with humiliation and rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing? You've just destroyed everything I've built." "No, Richard. I've protected what we built together. There's a difference. You can't run the company. You don't know the first thing about the technology or the industry relationships." I smiled at the familiar underestimation. "I don't need to. That's what competent executives are for, ones whose qualifications extend beyond their personal relationship with the CEO. My strength has always been in recognizing value and potential, both in investments and in people. Skills you once appreciated, before you forgot who I was." His anger deflated slightly, replaced by calculation. We had been married for 35 years after all. He knew my weaknesses as intimately as I knew his. "Ellie, we can discuss this privately. There's no need for public theatrics. Whatever you think is happening with Melissa..." "Stop." I held up my hand. "I'm not interested in explanations or negotiations tonight. The board meeting is at 8, tomorrow. Your future at Matthews Tech will be determined there, not in this conversation." "And our marriage?" he asked, a note of genuine uncertainty in his voice that surprised me. I considered the question seriously. "That depends on many things, Richard. Your honesty, your choices moving forward, your willingness to see me, truly see me, for perhaps the first time in decades." I stepped back from him. "But that's a conversation for another day. Tonight I'm going home." As I walked through the hotel lobby toward the waiting car I'd arranged, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not triumphant exactly, but unburdened. The careful silence I had maintained for so long had finally been broken, replaced by my authentic voice. I didn't know if my marriage could or should be saved. I didn't know how the company would evolve under my majority ownership. but I knew with absolute certainty that I would never again allow myself to become invisible within my own life. The car pulled away from the gleaming hotel, carrying me toward an uncertain but undeniably self-determined future. Whatever came next would be my choice, my creation. That knowledge alone was enough for now. The next morning, I arrived at Matthews Tech headquarters at precisely 7:30 a.m. I had slept surprisingly well, waking with the clarity that often follows momentous decisions. I wore another suit, navy this time, and carried a leather portfolio containing detailed notes on company operations, acquisitions, and personnel that my team of advisors had prepared over the preceding months. The security guard at the front desk did a double take as I approached, clearly unaccustomed to seeing the CEO's wife arriving unescorted. "Good morning, Mrs. Matthews. Are you here to see Mr. Matthews?" "No, Thomas," I replied, reading his name badge. "I'm here for the board meeting. Please issue me a full access security credential." He hesitated, uncertain of protocol. I waited patiently until he made a quick call, then watched his expression shift as he received confirmation of my new status. "Right away, Mrs. Matthews. My apologies." By 7:45, I was settled in the executive boardroom, reviewing documents and sipping coffee. Board members began arriving shortly after, some looking curious, others concerned, all treating me with a new deference that felt strange but not unwelcome. Richard arrived at 7:58, Melissa conspicuously absent. He had aged overnight, the strain evident in his face. He took a seat directly across from me, neither hostile nor conciliatory, just watchful. The meeting proceeded with remarkable efficiency. I presented evidence of Richard's misuse of company, resources in the Davis Innovation acquisition, outlined the conflicts of interest, and proposed a restructuring that would preserve his role in the company, but with reduced authority and transparent oversight. "You've been an excellent innovator and visionary, Richard," I acknowledged before the assembled board. "Those strengths should not be lost to Matthews Tech, but recent decisions demonstrate the need for more balanced leadership." The board, several members of whom had harbored their own concerns about Richard's increasingly unilateral management style, voted unanimously to accept my proposed changes. By 10 a.m., the immediate business was concluded, and a press release was being prepared, announcing my majority ownership and the evolution of executive leadership structures to support continued growth. As the board members filed out, Richard remained seated. When we were alone, he finally spoke. "You've been planning this for years." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I've been protecting myself, our children's inheritance, and, yes, the company, for years." The timing of the announcement was influenced by recent events, but the strategy long predates Melissa Davis. He nodded slowly. "I underestimated you. I always have." "Yes. What happens now, Ellie? To us?" I closed my portfolio and met his gaze directly. "That depends on what you want, Richard. Not what you think you should say or what might best position you within the company, but what you genuinely want for your future, for our future, if there is to be one." He seemed to consider this carefully, perhaps for the first time confronting the reality of potential consequences beyond the boardroom. "I need time to think. This is a lot to process." "Yes, it is. Take the time you need. I'll be staying at the lake house for the next week. When you're ready for an honest conversation, completely honest, Richard, you know where to find me." I stood and gathered my belongings, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, I didn't do this to punish you. I did it because it was necessary. For both of us, in different ways." The weeks that followed were transformative. The business press covered the Matthews Tech shakeup with predictable sensationalism, but the company itself stabilized quickly. I appointed a highly qualified CEO while maintaining strategic oversight as board chair. Melissa Davis quietly resigned. The Davis Innovation acquisition was restructured into a more advantageous licensing agreement. Richard and I entered counseling, separately at first, then together. The conversations were difficult, painful, revelatory. He admitted to affairs beyond Melissa, to resentments and insecurities I had never suspected beneath his confident exterior. I acknowledged my own role in our estrangement, the silence I had maintained, the separate life I had constructed without giving our marriage a genuine chance to evolve. We didn't reconcile, not in the traditional sense, but we did reach an understanding that honored our shared history while accepting its conclusion. We sold our family home and divided assets equitably. We attended Claire's wedding as amicable, co-parents rather than a united couple. We found a new way to exist in each other's lives that allowed us both dignity and independence. As for me, I discovered that 63 is not too late to begin again. I purchased a brownstone in Chicago, close to the symphony I'd always loved but seldom found time to attend. I established a foundation focusing on financial education for women in transition. I reconnected with old friends and made surprising, new ones. I even eventually began dating, a widowed literature professor who valued conversation and companionship above status or appearance. The company continued to thrive under the new leadership structure. Richard found his way back to what he truly loved, the creative problem-solving of early-stage development, within a clearly defined role that played to his strengths while protecting the organization from his weaknesses. Sometimes I reflect on the 35 years I spent becoming invisible, and I wonder whether I should regret them. But without those years, both the joy and the disillusionment, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't have my children, my hard-won wisdom, or the quiet confidence that comes from finally standing fully in my own truth. What I know now, what I wish I could tell my younger self, is this. Your voice matters. Your contributions matter. Your needs and desires matter, not because someone else validates them, but because you do. The moment you truly believe that is the moment your life begins to transform. My name is Eleanor Matthews. At 63 years old, I finally wrote my own story instead of accepting the role assigned to me in someone else's narrative. Whatever chapter comes next will be entirely my own creation, and that, perhaps, is the most powerful ownership of all. The board meeting I called for 8 a.m. was deliberately set early. I wanted everyone sharp, with minimal time to coordinate responses or manufacture excuses. I arrived at Matthews Tech headquarters at 7:15, nodding to the night security guard who clearly didn't know what to make of my presence. In 15 years of marriage, Richard had never brought me to the executive floor. "ID, ma'am?" the guard asked hesitantly. I smiled, removing the paperwork my attorney had prepared. "I'm Eleanor Matthews. As of yesterday, I am the majority shareholder of this company. Please call Daniel in IT. He should have prepared an executive access badge for—" The guard's eyes widened slightly as he made the call. 5 minutes later, I was being escorted to the executive suite by a bleary-eyed IT manager who kept stealing glances at me when he thought I wasn't looking. "The conference room has been prepared as requested, Mrs. Matthews," he said, swiping his badge at a set of glass doors. "Coffee service will arrive at 7:30. "Thank you, Daniel," I replied, setting my briefcase on the polished conference table. "And thank you for coming in early. I know this is unusual." He hesitated. "May I ask, is everything all right with Mr. Matthews?" The question was loaded with unspoken concerns. The staff knew something was happening, even if details hadn't yet spread. "Mr. Matthews is fine," I assured him. "But there are some organizational changes being implemented. You'll hear about them officially later today." After he left, I took a moment to absorb my surroundings. The conference room was impressive, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, a massive table of polished walnut, ergonomic chairs that probably cost more than our first car. This was Richard's domain. the empire he'd built while I managed our home, raised our children, and quietly made my own financial moves in the background. I opened my briefcase and arranged the documents inside: financial statements, acquisition records, the legal paperwork confirming my majority ownership, and a detailed proposal for restructuring the company leadership. Everything meticulously prepared, leaving nothing to chance. The board members began arriving at 7:45, 7 men and 2 women, most of whom I'd met at company functions over the years, but none who knew me beyond my role as Richard's wife. Their reactions to finding me seated at the head of the table ranged from confusion to curiosity to barely concealed alarm. James Whitaker, the CFO and Richard's closest ally on the board, approached first. "Mrs. Matthews, this is unexpected. Is Richard joining us?" "He'll be here shortly," I answered, gesturing to the seats. "Please, everyone, make yourselves comfortable. We have important matters to discuss." Richard arrived exactly at 7:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start. His expression when he saw me at the head of the table, his usual position, was one I'll never forget. Shock, quickly masked by practiced corporate composure, but with an undercurrent of barely restrained fury. He had clearly spent a sleepless night, his usual impeccable appearance showing subtle signs of strain. A slight wrinkle in his shirt collar, the Windsor knot of his tie not quite centered. "Ellie," he said tightly, "I think there's been some confusion about today's meeting." "No confusion, Richard," I replied evenly. "Please take a seat. We're about to begin." For a fraction of a second, I thought he might refuse, might create a scene in front of his executive team. But Richard had built his career on appearing in control at all times. He took a seat halfway down the table, a strategic position that didn't concede authority but avoided direct confrontation. At exactly 8 East, I called the meeting to order. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for accommodating this emergency session. I recognize this is unusual, so I'll be direct. As of yesterday, I have become the majority shareholder of Matthews Tech Enterprises, with 51% ownership." The room erupted in murmurs. Richard's jaw clenched visibly. I continued, sliding documents toward each board member. "You'll find verification of this transaction in the materials before you, along with a proposed restructuring of executive leadership that we'll be voting on today." James Whitaker flipped through the papers with growing alarm. "Mrs. Matthews, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. There are protocols for changes of this magnitude." "All protocols have been followed, Mr. Whitaker," I interrupted smoothly. "The transaction was conducted legally through established channels over a 15-year period. The documentation has been reviewed by our corporate counsel, who I believe is present." I looked toward Sandra Miller, the company's chief legal officer, who nodded reluctantly. "Unless there are specific legal concerns about the share acquisition itself, I suggest we move to the substantive matters before us." Richard finally spoke, his voice controlled but edged with ice. "The board deserves an explanation, Ellie. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" I met his gaze directly. "Transparency and accountability, Richard. Something this company has been lacking under your sole direction. Specifically, I'm concerned about the recent acquisition of Davis Innovation Group, which was pursued without proper due diligence and at a valuation significantly above market rate." I turned to the board. For those unaware, Melissa Davis, the founder of this recently acquired company, has been engaged in a personal relationship with our CEO for the past 8 months. This represents a clear conflict of interest that was not disclosed to the board prior to the acquisition approval. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Richard slamming his palm on the table. "That's enough. This is preposterous. You're using company resources to address a personal matter." "On the contrary," I interjected calmly, "I'm addressing a corporate governance issue that happens to intersect with personal matters. The distinction is important." I proceeded to outline the evidence my private investigator had compiled. Not the intimate details, but the documented meetings, the timeline of the relationship mapped against the accelerated acquisition process, the inflated valuation compared to industry standards. The board members' expressions shifted from shock to concern to calculation as the implications became clear. Sandra Miller, the legal counsel, cleared her throat. If these allegations are substantiated, this represents a serious breach of fiduciary duty and could expose the company to shareholder lawsuits. Precisely my concern, I agreed. Which is why I've proposed a restructuring that addresses these issues while preserving the company's stability and public image. I outlined my plan. Richard would transition from CEO to Chief Innovation Officer, a role that leveraged his creative strengths while removing him from financial decisions. An interim CEO would be appointed from outside the company while a search committee identified permanent leadership. The Davis acquisition would be reevaluated by an independent auditor, with adjustments made as necessary to ensure fair market value. These changes protect the company legally and financially while minimizing disruption to operations and market perception, I concluded. They also provide a path forward that recognizes Richard's valuable contributions while addressing the governance failures that led to our current situation. Throughout my presentation, Richard sat motionless, his expression hardening into something between disbelief and grim recognition. He was seeing me, truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time in decades, not as his supportive wife, but as a formidable opponent who had outmaneuvered him at his own game. The board discussion that followed was tense, but surprisingly productive. Several members, I discovered, had harbored their own concerns about Richard's increasingly autonomous management style, but had lacked the leverage to challenge him effectively. With my majority ownership providing that leverage, long suppressed, questions emerged about various decisions beyond the Davis acquisition. When the vote was called 2 hours later, my proposal passed unanimously, including, surprisingly, Richard's own vote. He understood the alternative was worse, a public ousting that would damage both his reputation and the company's stability. As the board members filed out, Richard remained seated. I closed my portfolio and waited, knowing this conversation was inevitable. 15 years, he finally said, his voice quiet. You've been planning this for 15 years. No, I corrected. I've been investing wisely for 15 years. The specific actions I'm taking now were necessitated by your recent choices. He leaned back, studying me with new eyes. I never thought you were interested in the business. You never asked questions, never wanted to be involved in company decisions. You never invited me to be involved, Richard. There's a difference. But you're right, I wasn't interested in running Matthews Tech. I still am not, particularly. I'm interested in ensuring that the company our family's financial security depends on is managed ethically and effectively. And punishing me for, Melissa, he added, a flash of the old defensiveness returning. I sighed, suddenly tired. Is that what you think this is about? Punishment? If I wanted to punish you, Richard, I could have done so much more publicly and destructively. What would you call it then? Consequence, I said simply. Not imposed by me, but inherent in the situation you created. When you chose to pursue a relationship with Melissa while remaining married to me, when you used company resources to benefit her financially, you set certain consequences in motion. I merely ensured they would unfold in a way that protected the company and my own interests. He absorbed this, then asked the question I had been expecting since the anniversary party. What about us, Ellie? Our marriage? I took a moment before answering, wanting my words to be precise and truthful. I don't know yet. That depends on many things. Your honesty moving forward, your willingness to acknowledge the full extent of what's happened, your authentic desire for reconciliation if that's what you claim to want. And if I don't know what I want? His voice had lost its corporate polish, revealing the confusion beneath. Then you should take time to figure that out before we have further discussions about our personal relationship, I said. I'll be staying at the lake house for the next week. When you're ready for an honest conversation, completely honest, Richard, you know where to find me. I stood, gathering my belongings. At the door, I paused. For what it's worth, I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because it was necessary. For the company, for myself, and yes, even for you, though you may not see that yet. The week at the lake house was a gift I gave myself. 7 days of solitude in the place that had always brought me peace. The small cedar cabin on Lake Michigan had been my one extravagance when my investments first began showing significant returns. I purchased it without consulting Richard, though not secretively. He had visited a few times over the years, but never seemed to connect with its simple comforts the way I did. I spent my days walking the shoreline, reading books I'd set aside for someday, and reflecting on the path that had led me to this crossroads. I had expected to feel triumphant after the board meeting, or perhaps vindictive. Instead, I felt something closer to grief, not just for my marriage, but for the decades spent diminishing myself to maintain it. On the 4th day, Claire called. Our daughter had always been perceptive, even as a child. Dad told me what happened, she said without preamble. Are you okay? I'm fine, I assured her. Better than fine, actually. How much did he tell you? Enough to make me realize how little I know about my own mother, she replied, her tone a mixture of admiration and concern. Dad said you've been buying company shares for years, that you own Matthews Tech now. Is that true? I own 51%, I confirmed. Enough to implement some necessary changes. Because of his affair with that marketing woman? I sighed. That was the catalyst, but the issues go deeper. Your father has been making unilateral decisions that put the company at risk. The affair with Melissa was just the most personal manifestation of a larger pattern. Claire was quiet for a moment. I always thought you were happy being in the background, letting Dad run things. That's how you seemed whenever I visited, taking care of everyone, making everything work perfectly without drawing attention to yourself. Her words stung because they contained truth. I was comfortable in that role for a long time, I acknowledged. Too comfortable, perhaps. It became a habit to be invisible, to measure my worth by how well I supported others, rather than what I created for myself. But that's changed now. Yes, I said simply. That's changed. Good, Claire said firmly. It's about time, Mom. Her support meant more than I could express. Adam called the next day, expressing similar sentiments, though more cautiously. He had always been close to Richard, modeling himself after his father's ambitious drive. Both of my children seemed to understand on some level that what had happened was necessary, even if it disrupted the family narrative they had grown up with. Richard arrived at the lake house on the 7th day, exactly 1 week after the board meeting. I watched from the deck as his car wound up the gravel driveway, noting how out of place his Mercedes sedan looked among the rustic surroundings. He emerged looking uncertain, carrying a small overnight bag, a presumption that might have annoyed me once, but now seemed merely sad. The drive up was beautiful, he offered as he approached the deck. I'd forgotten how peaceful it is here. That's why I bought it, I replied, not moving to help with his bag or usher him inside. These small acts of automatic service had defined our relationship for too long. There's coffee inside if you want some. We settled in the small living room, Richard taking in the simple furnishings with new eyes. You never decorated this place like our house, he observed. No expensive art, no designer furniture. I didn't buy it to impress anyone, I said, just to please myself. He nodded slowly, as if this concept required careful consideration. We sat in silence, the only sounds coming from the waves lapping at the shore beyond the windows and the occasional call of gulls overhead. I've been seeing a therapist, Richard finally said, surprising me. 3 sessions this week. Intensive. That's good, I replied carefully. What prompted that? besides the obvious public humiliation and professional demotion? He smiled wryly, then grew serious. I needed to understand how I got here. How I became someone who could betray you, risk everything we built, and somehow justify it to myself. I waited, not filling the silence as I might have in the past. The thing is, Ellie, I've been unhappy for years, he continued. Not with you, specifically. With myself. With the emptiness of what I was chasing. Each achievement, each expansion, each new contract, they were momentarily satisfying but never enough. There was always the next goal, the next acquisition, the next validation. And Melissa provided that validation, I suggested, keeping my tone neutral. He flushed slightly. Yes, but not in the way you might think. She admired the business persona I'd created, the successful CEO image. Being with her was like looking in a mirror that showed only my best angles. It was intoxicating, I suppose, but ultimately hollow. And now? I asked. Now that the mirror has shattered? Richard met my gaze directly. Now I'm trying to see myself clearly, without distortion. It's not a flattering view, Ellie. I've been selfish, arrogant, neglectful of what truly matters. I've treated you as an accessory to my success, rather than its foundation. I've taken for granted all you've contributed, to our family, to my career, to my very sense of self. His words were more self-aware than I had expected, but I remained cautious. That's a lot of insight for 1 week of therapy. It's been percolating longer than that, he admitted. Your announcement at the anniversary party. It was like having cold water thrown in my face. Suddenly I could see how completely I'd underestimated you, how blind I'd been to your capabilities because they didn't fit the narrative I'd constructed. I considered his words carefully before responding. I appreciate your honesty, Richard. But I need to know, what do you want now? From me, from our marriage, from your life moving forward? He hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, I saw something I had rarely witnessed in our 35 years together. Genuine vulnerability. I want another chance, he said quietly. Not to return to what we were. I see now how broken that was, but to discover what we might become. Something more equal, more honest. I want to know the woman who outmaneuvered me at my own game, who built a financial strategy so sound that none of my advisors detected it until it was complete. And Melissa? I asked, needing clarity on this point. Over, he said firmly. It ended the night of the anniversary party. Whatever it was, infatuation, midlife crisis, ego gratification, it pales in comparison to what I stand to lose with you. I nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting his answer. I think we need more time, Richard, both separately and together. This isn't a decision I can make in one conversation. Of course, he agreed quickly. Whatever you need. I'm not expecting forgiveness or reconciliation overnight. Just a willingness to explore possibilities. I can offer that much, I conceded. A willingness to explore, without promises or expectations. Starting with dinner tonight, I was planning to grill the lake trout I caught yesterday. His eyebrows rose. You fish now? I smiled slightly. There's a lot you don't know about me, Richard. That's part of the problem, isn't it? That evening set the pattern for what followed. A careful, sometimes awkward rediscovery of each other outside the roles we had inhabited for decades. We cooked together, walked the lakeshore, and talked more honestly than we had in years. Richard spoke about his insecurities beneath the successful exterior, his fear that without achievements to point to, he had no intrinsic value. I shared how invisibility had become both my shelter and my prison, how I had simultaneously resented and relied upon my background role. We returned to Chicago 2 days later, Richard to his new position at Matthews Tech, me to the organizational changes I was overseeing as majority shareholder. We agreed to live separately for a time. Richard in a downtown apartment, me in our family home that suddenly felt both too large and strangely liberating. The media coverage of the Matthews Tech shakeup was intensive, but mercifully brief. Business publications praised the transparent handling of the leadership transition, while gossip columns speculated wildly about the personal drama behind it. Both Richard and I declined all interview requests, issuing only a joint statement confirming the organizational changes and asking for privacy regarding our personal relationship. Melissa Davis resigned from Matthews Tech the day after the Bach-Free board meeting, negotiating a settlement that avoided litigation but required her silence regarding company matters. I never spoke with her directly, though I sometimes wondered what Richard had told her about me during their relationship. Had he portrayed me as the devoted but simple wife, incapable of understanding his business world? The thought no longer hurt as it once might have. Her underestimation of me, like Richard's, had been her miscalculation. 3 months after the anniversary party, I made another decision that surprised even me. I enrolled in an executive MBA program designed for experienced professionals transitioning to corporate leadership. At 63, I was easily the oldest student in the cohort, but my practical experience compensated for academic rustiness. The younger students initially regarded me with curiosity that gradually transformed into respect as they recognized the value of my perspective. Richard supported this decision wholeheartedly, even offering to review my assignments when I struggled with certain technical concepts. It was strange and somewhat wonderful to engage with him intellectually in this new way, as colleagues rather than as husband and wife with prescribed roles. Our relationship evolved gradually during this period. We met regularly, for dinner, for walks along the lakeshore, occasionally for events related to Matthews Tech. Sometimes these encounters ended with strained politeness, other times with genuine laughter or moments of unexpected intimacy. We were building something new between us, though neither of us could yet define its shape. 6 months after moving out, Richard asked if he could come home. Not permanently, not yet, but for a weekend, to talk, to see if reconciliation might be possible. I agreed, with clear boundaries and expectations discussed in advance. Those 2 days were among the most emotionally exhausting and ultimately clarifying of my life. We acknowledged hard truths, that our marriage had been fundamentally unbalanced from the beginning, that we had both participated in creating and maintaining that imbalance. That true partnership would require dismantling patterns established over 35 years. We discussed whether such reconstruction was possible or even desirable at our stage of life. I can't go back to being invisible, I told him during our most difficult conversation. Even if you never intended that role for me, it's where we ended up. I won't sacrifice my newly found voice, not even to save our marriage. I don't want you to, Richard replied, surprising me. The woman you've become, forthright, confident, unapologetically powerful, is someone I'm still getting to know, but someone I respect immensely. More than that, she's someone who keeps me honest in ways the previous version of our relationship never did. And that's what you want? Honesty over comfort? Challenge over compliance? He considered the question seriously. I want what I need at this point in my life is authenticity. In myself, in my relationships, in my work. I spent decades constructing an image that impressed others but left me hollow. I don't want to waste whatever time remains living behind that facade. His words resonated with my own journey. I think we need more time, I said finally. Not apart, necessarily, but in this new configuration, finding our way towards something sustainable. Richard moved back home the following month, into the guest room initially. Our children were cautiously supportive, though Claire in particular remained skeptical of her father's capacity for genuine change. Just promise me you won't disappear again, Mom, she insisted during a private conversation. No matter what happens with Dad. Never again, I assured her. That chapter is permanently closed. As weeks became months, Richard and I established new patterns. We maintained separate professional lives, he focusing on innovation at Matthews Tech, I dividing my time between my MBA studies and my responsibilities as majority shareholder. At home, we renegotiated everything from household tasks to financial decisions, sometimes awkwardly, occasionally with heated disagreement, but always with a commitment to equity that had previously been absent. The physical dimension of our relationship was the slowest to rebuild. Intimacy after betrayal requires a trust that cannot be rushed or manufactured. We moved cautiously, beginning with small gestures, a touch on the shoulder, fingers brushing while passing coffee, eventually, tentative embraces that grew more confident over time. 9 months after the anniversary party, Richard completed his therapy program. To mark the occasion, he presented me with an unexpected gift, a leather-bound journal containing his reflections on our marriage, his affair with Melissa, and his hopes for our future. The final entry was a letter addressed to me. Eleanor. It began, using my full name in a way he rarely had before. I cannot undo the pain I've caused or reclaim the years we spent in misaligned understanding of each other. What I can offer is a promise, not of perfection, but of presence. Of seeing you completely, valuing you entirely, and walking beside rather than ahead of you for whatever journey remains. If you'll have me as your partner in this new chapter, I will consider myself the most fortunate of men. If not, I will accept that consequence of my actions with respect for your decision. It was not a grand romantic gesture, but something more meaningful. An acknowledgement of reality, of accountability, of genuine choice. I didn't answer immediately, taking the time to sit with my own feelings rather than responding to his needs as I might have once done automatically. A week later, I invited Richard to the lake house again. As we sat on the deck watching the sunset paint the water in golds and pinks, I gave him my response, not in words initially, but in a document of my own. It was a draft of a new operating agreement for our relationship, modeled intentionally after a business partnership agreement. This isn't very romantic, Richard observed with a slight smile as he read through the clearly articulated expectations, boundaries, and commitments. Romance hasn't served us particularly well, I pointed out. Perhaps it's time to try a different approach. He continued reading, nodding at certain points, frowning thoughtfully at others. When he finished, he looked up with unexpected brightness in his eyes. It's perfect, Ellie. Unconventional, but perfect for us at this stage. I especially appreciate the annual review provision. I laughed despite myself. Only 2 executives would include performance metrics in their marriage renewal. Is that what this is? He asked, his tone careful. A renewal? I considered the question, aware of its weight. I think it's a new beginning, I said finally. Using the wisdom gained from our past without being bound by its limitations, a deliberate choice rather than a default continuation. Richard set the document aside and took my hand, his touch questioning rather than presumptive. I choose this, he said simply. I choose you, the real you, not the convenient version I constructed to fit my narrative. If you'll have me, I'd like to discover what we might build together on more equal ground. I interlaced my fingers with his, this familiar hand now holding mine in an unfamiliar way, not possessive, not controlling, but connecting. Yes, I said. Let's find out. The reconciliation that followed wasn't perfect or complete. There were difficult days, painful conversations, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But there was also genuine growth, surprising discoveries about each other, and a hard-won mutual respect that our previous incarnation had lacked. 1 year after the anniversary party that had changed everything, we held a small private ceremony at the lake house. Not a vow renewal exactly, but a conscious recommitment ceremony attended only by Claire, Adam, and their partners. We exchanged simple bands inscribed with a single word, equal. Matthews Tech continued to thrive under its new leadership structure. I completed my executive MBA and took a more active role in strategic planning while maintaining the independence I had fought so hard to establish. Richard flourished in his more focused position, freed from the administrative burdens that had never suited his creative temperament. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I reflect on the woman I was before, the invisible wife who measured her worth by how well she supported others' ambitions. I feel compassion for her, understanding the complex factors that shaped her choices. But I don't regret her departure. The woman I've become, visible, vocal, unapologetically powerful in her 7th decade, is the woman I was always meant to be. What I know now, what I wish I could tell my younger self, is this: your voice matters. Your contributions matter. Your needs and desires matter. Not because someone else validates them, but because you do. The moment you truly believe that is, the moment your transformation begins. My name is Eleanor Matthews. At 63, I finally stepped out of the shadow of my own making and into the light of self-determination. Whatever chapter comes next will be written in my own hand, with my own voice, according to my own vision of what matters most. And that, perhaps, is the most profound ownership of all. The transition at Matthews Tech proceeded more smoothly than anyone might have expected, given the dramatic circumstances. In the months following my revelation at our anniversary party, I worked closely with the board to implement a careful restructuring plan. We brought in Stephanie Chen, a highly respected industry veteran, as interim CEO, while conducting a thorough search for permanent leadership. Richard's new role as Chief Innovation Officer kept him engaged with the company's creative direction, but removed him from financial decisions that had previously gone unchecked. I had braced myself for resistance, from employees loyal to Richard, from business partners uncertain about the stability of the company, from shareholders concerned about value fluctuations. Instead, I found surprising support across all fronts. Several senior managers privately expressed relief that long-standing issues were finally being addressed. 2 major clients reached out to commend the transparency with which we handled the leadership transition. Even the stock price, after an initial dip, stabilized and then began a steady climb as our new governance structure proved effective. What I hadn't anticipated was my own evolving relationship with the company. What had begun as a strategic investment, a safety net built without Richard's knowledge, was becoming something more personal. As I attended board meetings and strategy sessions, I found myself genuinely engaged with the business in ways I had never expected. My financial acumen, honed through years of private study and careful investing, brought a perspective that complemented the technical expertise of other board members. "You missed your calling, Eleanor." James Whitaker, the CFO who had initially been so skeptical of my intervention, commented after a particularly productive budget review. "You have an instinct for identifying value that can't be taught." "Not missed," I corrected him gently. "Just delayed." That became my mantra during this period of transformation. Not missed, just delayed. At 63, I was finally stepping into roles and exploring capabilities that had remained dormant during decades of supporting Richard's career and raising our children. Far from feeling that it was too late, I experienced a curious sense of perfect timing, as if my accumulated wisdom provided exactly the foundation needed for this new chapter. The executive MBA program I enrolled in became a central part of this evolution. 3 evenings a week, I joined cohorts of ambitious professionals, most decades younger than myself, in classes ranging from organizational behavior to financial modeling. The technical aspects challenged me. I spent long hours mastering concepts that seemed to come naturally to classmates with more recent educational experience. But when discussions turned to real-world application, to the human elements of business and leadership, I found my experience provided insights that textbooks couldn't capture. Professor Daniels, who taught our leadership ethics seminar, often called on me first during case discussions. "Mrs. Matthews brings a longitudinal perspective that's invaluable," he explained to the class. "She's witnessed how decisions play out not just over quarters, but over decades." Initially, some classmates viewed me with curiosity or even skepticism, the grandmother figure who had somehow wandered into their professional development space. Gradually, this perception shifted. Study groups began seeking me out. Young women in particular wanted to hear about my journey, often staying after class to ask questions about balancing ambition with family responsibilities. "How did you manage it all?" one promising marketing executive in her 30s asked during a coffee break. "Career, children, marriage, and still finding time to build your own investments?" The question gave me pause. The truth, that I had sublimated my own ambitions for decades before finally reclaiming them, wasn't the inspirational narrative she was seeking. But I owed her honesty more than comfort. "I didn't manage it all," I admitted. "Not simultaneously. I made choices that prioritized my family's needs over my professional development for many years. Those weren't wrong choices necessarily, but they came with costs I didn't fully recognize at the time." "So you're saying it's not possible?" she asked, disappointment evident in her voice. "I'm saying the narrative of having it all simultaneously is a trap," I clarified. "What I've learned is that life unfolds in chapters. In some, your career may take precedence. In others, family needs demand center stage. The key is recognizing that you're the author of your story. You get to decide which chapter you're writing at any given time." She considered this, then asked the question I was increasingly hearing from younger women. "Do you regret waiting so long to pursue your own ambitions?" "Regret is complicated," I answered carefully. "I don't regret the years I gave to raising my children or supporting my husband's career. Those experiences shaped me in essential ways. What I regret is allowing myself to become invisible in the process, to lose sight of my own identity separate from my roles as wife and mother." These conversations became increasingly common as news of my corporate takeover spread beyond business circles. I found myself reluctantly becoming something of a symbol, the overlooked wife who had quietly outmaneuvered her unfaithful husband at his own game. It wasn't a narrative I particularly embraced, reducing as it did the complex reality of our 35-year marriage to a simplistic revenge tale. But I understood its appeal, particularly to women who had faced their own versions of invisibility. Richard, to his credit, handled the transition with more grace than I had expected. In his new role, freed from the administrative burdens that had never suited his temperament, he seemed to rediscover his passion for innovation. The engineering team responded enthusiastically to his more focused leadership, developing 2 promising new product lines within months of the restructuring. We maintained a careful distance at company functions, professional but not overly familiar. The speculation about our personal relationship continued in hallway whispers and industry gossip, but neither of us fed it with public drama. Whatever resolution we might reach privately would remain private, at least that much we agreed upon. Our separate living arrangements, Richard in his downtown apartment, me in our family home, provided the space needed for individual reflection. I used this period to reconnect with parts of myself that had been neglected during marriage. I resumed playing the piano after a 30-year hiatus, joined a book club focused on international literature, took weekly hikes in the nature preserve, outside the city. Small pleasures, perhaps, but ones that were purely my own, not tied to anyone else's preferences or needs. Richard and I still met regularly, for dinner, for discussions about Matthew's tech, occasionally to attend events related to our children's lives. These encounters had an odd quality, simultaneously familiar and strange, as if we were getting to know each other for the first time after decades of marriage. In many ways, we were. I never knew you were interested in Russian literature. Richard commented during one dinner after I mentioned my book club's focus on Tolstoy. I studied it in college, I reminded him. Before we met. Did you? I don't remember you ever mentioning that. You never asked. The words weren't accusatory, simply factual. And after a while, I stopped volunteering information that didn't seem relevant to our shared life. Richard absorbed this, frowning slightly. I'm realizing how little attention I paid to your interests over the years. How much of yourself you set aside. We both made choices, I acknowledged. You focused narrowly on building your career. I focused narrowly on supporting that career and raising our children. Neither of us prioritized knowing each other beyond on those roles. And now? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Now, we have the opportunity to decide whether we want to build something different, something based on who we actually are rather than who we've pretended to be. These conversations were difficult, often uncomfortable, but necessary for whatever might come next. We were dismantling the structure of a marriage built over 35 years, examining each component to determine what was worth preserving and what needed to be discarded. Some days the task seemed impossible, other days surprisingly hopeful. Our children observed this process with understandable concern. Claire, always protective of me, remained skeptical of her father's capacity for genuine change. People don't transform overnight, Mom, she warned during a weekend visit. Especially not men who've spent decades benefiting from the status quo. It's not overnight, I pointed out. It's been 6 months since the anniversary party. And your father is doing the work, therapy, honest conversations, real reflection on his choices. Claire studied me with the same analytical gaze she brought to her legal cases. And you believe him? After what he did with Melissa? I believe he's sincerely trying, I said carefully. Whether that's enough remains to be seen. Just promise. Me one thing, she insisted, taking my hands in hers. Promise you won't make decisions based on what's comfortable or familiar. You deserve more than that. Her concern touched me deeply. I promise, sweetheart. I'm not going backwards, regardless of what happens with your father. Adam's perspective was more nuanced. During a rare father-son lunch that Richard had shared details about afterward, Adam had apparently challenged him directly about the affair and its implications. I always looked up to you, he had told his father. Built my own marriage on, say, what I thought you and Mom had. Now, I'm questioning everything. This confrontation, more than any other consequence, seemed to shake Richard to his core. The possibility that his choices might negatively influence our son's marriage haunted him. In response, he redoubled his commitment to the therapeutic process, working intensively with Dr. Levine on understanding the patterns that had led to his infidelity and emotional disconnection. 7 months after the anniversary party, Richard invited me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant where we had celebrated our first anniversary so many years ago. I recognized the symbolic choice but appreciated that he didn't belabor it. I have something to share with you, he said after we had ordered. Something my therapist has encouraged me to articulate. I nodded, waiting. Richard took a deep breath. I've been working to understand why, after 35 years of marriage to an intelligent, beautiful, capable woman, I would risk everything for a relationship as shallow as what I had with Melissa. The easy answer would be midlife crisis or simple physical attraction, but that's not the truth. He paused, collecting his thoughts. The truth is more difficult to admit. I was drawn to Melissa because she saw only the successful CEO I pretended to be. With her, I could maintain the illusion that I was completely in control, completely confident, completely worthy of admiration. She didn't know my insecurities, my failures, my deepest fears. And I did, I supplied. Yes, or at least you knew more of them, which made me feel vulnerable in ways I never confronted properly. So instead of embracing that vulnerability as part of authentic intimacy, I created distance. I compartmentalized our marriage as something separate from my real life of business achievement. His insight surprised me. That's quite self-aware, Richard. Painfully so, he acknowledged with a rueful smile. And there's more. In my sessions with Dr. Levine, I've come to recognize how my father's emotional absence shaped my approach to relationships. How I learned early that achievement was the only reliable path to validation. How I applied that same metric to our marriage, believing that providing financial success was sufficient evidence of commitment. I absorbed his words, recognizing their authenticity. This wasn't the polished corporate speak Richard typically employed to navigate difficult conversations. This was something rawer, more vulnerable than I had witnessed from him in decades. "Thank you for sharing that," I said finally. "It helps me understand some aspects of our history better." "There's one more thing," Richard continued, meeting my gaze directly. "I want you to know that I'm doing this work for myself, not just as a strategy to win you back. Whether or not we find a way forward together, I need to address these patterns. I don't want to be that man anymore. The one who builds his identity on external validation while remaining emotionally disconnected from the people who matter most." His words touched something deep within me. Not a romantic rekindling, but a recognition of parallel journeys. As I had been working to reclaim my visibility and voice, Richard had been confronting the hollowness behind his carefully constructed facade. We were both in our 60s, finally addressing fundamental questions of identity and authenticity that most people tackled decades earlier. "I respect that, Richard," I said sincerely. "And I'm engaged in similar work, understanding how and why I allowed myself to become invisible, even to myself. How I measured my worth through others' success rather than my own. We've wasted a lot of time, haven't we?" he asked quietly. I considered this, then shook my head. Not wasted exactly. Those years weren't empty. We raised 2 remarkable children, built careers, contributed to our community. But we lived at a strange distance from ourselves and each other. That's what I'm trying to change now. "As am I," Richard agreed. "And I've been wondering lately, is there room in this new chapter of your life for us to explore a different kind of relationship? Not returning to what was, but creating something new that honors who we're becoming." The question hung between us, weighty with possibility and risk. 8 months earlier, I might have rejected the suggestion outright, too wounded by betrayal and too energized by newfound independence to consider reconciliation in any form. Now, with the perspective gained through therapy and personal growth, I could see nuances previously obscured by pain and anger. "I think there might be," I answered carefully. "Not immediately, and not without clear boundaries and expectations. But yes, I'm open to exploring possibilities." The relief in Richard's expression was palpable. "That's more than I dared hope for, Ellie." "It's not a promise," I cautioned. "Just a willingness to continue the conversation, to see whether what we're learning about ourselves might create the foundation for something healthier than what we had before." "I understand," he assured me, "and I'm grateful for even that much." We finished dinner discussing lighter topics, a book we had both coincidentally read, Adam's recent promotion at the hospital, Claire's consideration of a judicial appointment. For the first time in months, conversation flowed naturally between us, without the weight of unspoken recriminations or carefully maintained facades. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a genuine connection, perhaps the most authentic we had shared in years. As spring bloomed across Chicago, my life settled into new patterns. 3 evenings a week were dedicated to my MBA courses, challenging my intellect in ways that left me simultaneously exhausted and invigorated. 2 mornings a week, I met with Stephanie Chen, the interim CEO, to discuss Matthew's tech strategy and operations. Weekends often found me at the lake house, sometimes alone with my thoughts, occasionally hosting Claire or Adam and their partners for relaxed family time. Richard and I continued our careful exploration of whatever might come next. We met regularly for dinner, for walks along the lake shore, once for a symphony performance we both had wanted to attend. These weren't dates in the conventional sense. More, like opportunities to rediscover each other outside the roles we had inhabited for so long. "I never knew you had such strong opinions about Mahler," Richard commented as we left the symphony hall, referring to my detailed critique of the performance. "I majored in music before switching to finance," I reminded him. "You knew that. Technically. It was on my resume when we first met. Knowing facts isn't the same as understanding what matters to someone," he acknowledged. "I never bothered to learn what music meant to you, did I?" "No," I agreed. "But neither did I insist on being known. I let my interests become secondary, optional aspects of my identity rather than essential elements you needed to engage with." These moments of mutual recognition, of shared responsibility for the distance that had grown between us, became increasingly common. Neither of us was interested in simplistic narratives of villain and victim. The reality, as we both came to acknowledge, was far more complex. 2 people who had constructed a life together while systematically avoiding authentic intimacy, each for our own reasons. 9 months after the anniversary party, Richard asked, a question I had been anticipating, "Would you consider marriage counseling, Ellie? Not to fix what was broken, but to help us design what might be possible moving forward." I had been considering the same possibility. "Yes, I think that would be valuable, but I'd want someone with experience working with older couples specifically. Someone who understands the particular challenges of reinventing a relationship after decades together." Richard agreed, and we found Dr. Sophia Mendez, a relationship therapist specializing in life transitions for couples in their 50s and beyond. Her approach was refreshingly practical, less focused on excavating past hurts than on establishing clear expectations and communication patterns for the future. "You've both done significant individual work," she observed during our 3rd session. "That's unusual and promising. Most couples I see at this stage are either ready to call it quits or desperately trying to return to a comfortable but dysfunctional status quo." "Neither option appeals to me," I said honestly. "I'm not interested in divorce for its own sake. But I have no desire to return to the marriage we had before." "Nor do I," Richard added. That marriage wasn't serving either of us well, though I didn't recognize it until recently. Dr. Mendez nodded approvingly. "So the question becomes, what kind of relationship do you want to create now, with the wisdom you've both gained? What values and practices would form its foundation?" This framing, creating something new rather than repairing something broken, resonated deeply with both of us. Over the following weeks, we engaged in structured exercises designed to articulate our individual needs and shared vision. We discussed everything from financial transparency to emotional intimacy, from how we made decisions to how we expressed affection. Nothing was assumed or taken for granted. Every aspect of our potential future together was deliberately examined and negotiated. "You're essentially creating a new relationship contract," Dr. Mendez explained during one particularly productive session. "Not just implicitly, as most couples do, but explicitly, with clear terms that you both understand and agree to." The concept appealed to my analytical nature. "A contract implies accountability," I noted. "Specific commitments, not just general good intentions." "Exactly," she confirmed, "and regular review periods to assess how it's working for both parties." Richard smiled at this. "Annual performance reviews for our marriage? That sounds bizarrely appropriate for us. I laughed, recognizing the truth in his observation. We're bringing our professional strengths to our personal relationship. Why not use what works? 10 months after the anniversary party, Richard moved back into our family home. Not into our former bedroom, but into the guest suite at the opposite end of the house. This arrangement, suggested by Dr. Mendez, gave us physical proximity while maintaining personal space as we continued rebuilding trust and connection. We shared meals, household responsibilities, and social activities as agreed upon in our relationship contract, but maintained separate domains for personal time and independent interests. The arrangement raised eyebrows among friends who expected either complete reconciliation or definitive separation. Nothing in between. I found myself increasingly comfortable disappointing others' expectations. My focus remained on what worked, for us, not on conforming to external standards of what marriage should look like, especially at our age. People seem to think there's a standard timeline for recovering from infidelity, I commented to Richard one evening as we prepared dinner together. 3 months of separation, then either divorce or reconciliation, with nothing in between. We've never been conventional, Richard replied, chopping vegetables with surprising skill, a new hobby he had developed during his months of independent living. Why start now? I smiled at this unexpected perspective from a man who had once been so concerned with appearances. Indeed. Why start now? Our children adjusted to this unconventional arrangement with varying degrees of acceptance. Adam, pragmatic by nature, focused on the positive aspects. You both seem happier, he observed during a Sunday visit. More authentic somehow. That's what matters, right? Claire remained more cautious, protective of my newfound independence. Just make sure this is what you want, Mom, she advised privately. Not what's expected or convenient. I've spent decades doing what was expected and convenient, I reminded her gently. I'm well past that now. Her expression softened. Yes, you are. And it looks good on you. As the 1-year mark of the anniversary party approached, Richard and I discussed how to acknowledge this complicated milestone. Neither of us wanted to recreate the public spectacle of the previous year, but simply ignoring the date seemed equally inappropriate. What would feel meaningful to you? Richard asked as we walked along the lake shore one crisp spring morning. Not what you think I expect or what others might approve of, but what would honor your journey over this past year? I considered the question thoughtfully. Something simple but intentional. Perhaps at the lake house, a place that has always been authentically mine, not a reflection of our shared public image. I like that, he agreed. A private ceremony of some kind? Just us and the children if they want to attend? Yes, but not a vow renewal in the traditional sense, I clarified. More like a conscious recommitment ceremony, acknowledging what we've learned, what we're leaving behind, and what we're choosing to build moving forward. The idea took shape over the following weeks. We worked with Dr. Mendez to craft a ceremony that reflected our unique journey, not a romantic fairy tale of forgiveness and reunion, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of hard truths and deliberate choices. We selected readings that spoke to transformation and authenticity rather than conventional romantic ideals. We crafted personal statements that honored both our shared history and our individual growth. When the day arrived, exactly 1 year after the anniversary party that had changed everything, we gathered at the lake house under a clear blue sky. Claire and Adam attended with their partners, initially skeptical but ultimately supportive of the intentionality behind the ceremony. We stood facing each other on the deck overlooking the water, neither dressed formally, but both presenting our best selves. Me in a simple linen dress the color of the lake, Richard in a crisp shirt, and slacks rather than his usual corporate suit. Dr. Mendez, who had agreed to officiate, opened with words that set the tone for what followed. We gather today not to pretend that the past year hasn't happened, nor to erase 36 years of complex shared history. Instead, we come together to mark a conscious choice, the decision to create something new from the wisdom gained through difficulty and growth. Richard spoke first, his voice steady as he addressed me directly. Eleanor, I stand before you today, not as the man you married, nor even as the man who betrayed your trust a year ago. I stand here as someone in the process of becoming more honest, more present, more worthy of genuine partnership. I cannot promise perfection, but I commit to showing up authentically, to seeing you completely, and to building together whatever comes next with equal voice and equal responsibility. When my turn came, the words I had carefully prepared flowed naturally. Richard, our journey has taken unexpected turns, bringing pain but also clarity. I choose to stand here today not from obligation or habit, but from a place of strength and self-knowledge that would have been impossible a year ago. I bring to this new chapter my whole self, my intelligence, my creativity, my needs and boundaries. I commit to partnership based on mutual respect and equal value, knowing that what we build now will be stronger for having been deliberately chosen rather than passively accepted. We exchanged simple bands inscribed with a single word that captured the essence of our new commitment: equal. Not romantic symbols of eternal love, but practical reminders of the foundation upon which whatever came next would be built. As the small ceremony concluded, Claire embraced me with unexpected emotion. I didn't think this would move me, she admitted quietly, but seeing you so clear-eyed and strong, it's like meeting my mother for the first time. Her words captured something essential about my journey over the past year. In many ways, I was meeting myself for the first time, discovering capabilities and convictions that had always existed beneath the accommodating surface I had presented to the world. The woman who stood on that deck, making conscious choices about her future, was simultaneously the person I had always been and someone entirely new. Later that evening, after our children had departed and Richard and I sat watching the sunset over the lake, he asked a question that caught me by surprise. "Are you happy, Ellie?" The query was striking in its simplicity and in how rarely it had been posed during our decades together. I considered it carefully before answering. "I'm not sure 'happy' is precisely the right word," I said finally. "I feel aligned, congruent. The person I present to the world now matches who I am internally. That brings a kind of peace I've never experienced before." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. It's exhausting, isn't it? Maintaining the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be." "Exhausting," I agreed, "and ultimately, hollow." We sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the water, each contemplating the journey that had brought us to this moment and the path that stretched ahead. Not a return to what had been, but a conscious creation of something new, something equal. 18 months after my revelation at our anniversary party, Matthews Tech held its annual shareholders meeting. For the first time, I attended not as Richard's wife, but as board chairperson, presenting our yearly results alongside Cynthia Okafor, the permanent CEO we had selected after Stephanie Chen's successful interim tenure. The grand ballroom at the Peninsula, the same venue where I had revealed my majority ownership, looked different from this perspective. Instead of standing on the periphery while Richard commanded the spotlight, I now took center stage, presenting the company's strategic vision to investors, analysts, and business partners. Matthews Tech has undergone significant transformation over the past year and a half, I began, surveying the packed room with a confidence that felt natural now, no longer forced. Today, I'm pleased to report that this evolution has yielded exceptional results. The financial data projected behind me told a compelling story. Stock values up 27%, 3 new product lines successfully launched, strategic acquisitions in emerging markets, Employee retention improved by 18%. Numbers that validated the governance changes I had implemented and the leadership team I had helped assemble. These achievements reflect our renewed commitment to innovation balanced with accountability, I continued, to creative risk-taking supported by responsible oversight, to growth that benefits all stakeholders, employees, investors, and the communities we serve. As I spoke, I noticed Richard seated in the front row, nodding attentively. In his role as Chief Innovation Officer, he had indeed flourished, driving product development with a passion and focus that had sometimes been diluted when he carried the full weight of executive leadership. We had found, somewhat ironically, that the restructuring that began as my response to his betrayal had ultimately benefited his professional satisfaction as well. After the formal presentations, during the reception that followed, I navigated the room with practiced ease. 18 months of board meetings, investor relations, and industry conferences had honed my capacity for business socializing, an arena I had once left entirely to Richard. I found I enjoyed these interactions more than expected, particularly when they focused on substantive business matters rather than the superficial networking that had dominated similar events in the past. "Mrs. Matthews, your leadership during this transition has been remarkable," commented James Liu, a significant investor who had initially expressed concerns about the company's stability after the leadership change. Many organizations would have faltered under similar circumstances, yet Matthews Tech has emerged stronger. "Thank you, Mr. Liu," I replied. "We've been fortunate to have a talented team willing to embrace necessary changes. And please, call me Eleanor." "Eleanor, then," he amended with a respectful nod. "I've been particularly impressed by the innovations coming from your husband's department. The restructuring seems to have unleashed creative energy that was perhaps constrained in the previous organizational model." His observation echoed my own thoughts. Richard has always been at his best when focused on innovation rather than administrative matters, I acknowledged. The new structure better aligns with his natural strengths. "A wise leader recognizes where each person's talents can be most effectively deployed," Liu noted, including her own. The compliment, delivered with sincere respect rather than the condescension I might have encountered in earlier days, reflected how my position had evolved. I was no longer viewed as Richard's wife who somehow acquired company shares, but as a strategic leader in my own right, one who had demonstrated sound judgment during a challenging transition. Later that evening, as Richard and I drove home, together from the event, now a common occurrence as our carefully negotiated reconciliation continued, he offered his own perspective on the day's proceedings. "You were magnificent up there, Ellie," he said, genuine admiration in his voice, completely in command, thoroughly prepared, but also warm and authentic. The room responded to that combination. "Thank you," I replied, accepting the compliment, without deflection, another habit I had worked to break. It felt natural today, not performative. "That's why it worked so well," Richard observed. "You're not playing a role anymore. You're simply being Eleanor Matthews, impressive in her own right." His words captured something essential about my journey over the past 18 months. The external changes, becoming majority shareholder, completing my executive MBA, assuming a leadership role at Matthews Tech, were significant. But the internal transformation was more profound. I had stopped performing the part of supportive wife and started living authentically as myself, with all the complexity that entailed. The recommitment ceremony we had held 6 months earlier at the lake house had marked an important milestone in this evolution, not just in our marriage, but in my relationship with myself. The simple bands inscribed with equal that we now wore represented a foundational shift in how we approached our partnership. Richard, too, had undergone his own transformation. His initial contrition following the revelation of his affair with Melissa could have remained surface level, a temporary adjustment designed to weather the crisis. Instead, through continued therapy and genuine self-reflection, he had confronted long-standing patterns of emotional avoidance and validation-seeking behavior. The man who drove beside me now was simultaneously familiar and new. Richard without the carefully maintained facade that had defined him for decades. "I was thinking," he said as we neared home, interrupting my reflections, "about our vacation plans for the summer. You mentioned wanting to visit Claire in London." "Yes, I'd like to see her new flat and meet this professor she's been dating," I confirmed. "Why? What if we extended the trip? After London, we could spend 2 weeks in Italy. The Amalfi Coast, perhaps. We've talked about going for years, but never made it happen. In our previous life, this suggestion would have been presented as a decision already made. Dates selected, accommodations booked, my role limited to packing appropriate attire. The open-ended nature of his proposal reflected our new dynamic. "That sounds wonderful," I replied. "Let's look at the calendar together tomorrow and see what makes sense with my board commitments and your product development schedule." This collaborative approach to decision-making, once foreign to our relationship, had become our new normal. From household matters to financial planning to leisure activities, we now operated as genuine partners, each with equal voice, equal consideration, and equal responsibility. The changes extended to our living arrangements as well. After 3 months in separate bedrooms following Richard's return to our family home, we had gradually resumed sharing a living space, but one reconfigured to reflect our individual needs. The master bedroom suite had been renovated to include separate dressing areas and workspaces alongside the shared sleeping area. What might have seemed like an unusual arrangement for a married couple in their 60s felt right for us. A physical manifestation of our both together and independent approach. As spring warmed into summer, my days settled into a rhythm that balanced professional engagement with personal fulfillment. Having completed my executive MBA, I now divided my time between Matthew's Tech Board responsibilities, mentoring sessions with young women entrepreneurs through a program I had helped establish, and the foundation I had created focused on financial literacy for women in transition. The Eleanor Matthews Foundation had begun as a modest initiative funded from my personal investments, aimed at providing practical financial education for women navigating major life changes: divorce, widowhood, career transitions, retirement planning. What started as a series of workshops at community centers around Chicago had quickly expanded, attracting both participants and donors who recognized the critical need for such resources. "The program you've built addresses a gap that traditional financial services have ignored for decades," noted Evelyn Torres, a prominent philanthropist who had become an early supporter. "Women who find themselves suddenly responsible for complex financial decisions without the background knowledge to make informed choices." "It's a vulnerability I understand intimately," I acknowledged during a foundation event. Even with my accounting background, I had to educate myself extensively before I felt confident making independent investment decisions. Most women don't have that foundational knowledge to build upon. The curriculum we developed was practical, rather than theoretical, focusing on immediate skills women needed during periods of transition while gradually introducing more complex concepts. Workshops on basic budgeting and credit management expanded into sessions on investment strategies, tax planning, and long-term financial security. What I found most rewarding was witnessing the transformation of participants as they moved from financial anxiety to confidence. Women who had initially attended workshops overwhelmed and fearful gradually became capable of navigating complex financial landscapes, making informed decisions about their futures rather than relying on others' guidance. "You've changed my life," one participant, a 57-year-old widow named Marjorie, told me after completing the 6-month program. "For the first time, I'm not afraid of outliving my money. I understand what I have, how to protect it, and how to make it work for me." Her words resonated deeply. Financial knowledge wasn't just about dollars and percentages. It was about agency, independence, and peace of mind. The Foundation's work had become an unexpected passion, one that connected my professional expertise with my personal journey in ways I hadn't anticipated. Richard supported this endeavor with genuine enthusiasm, occasionally offering to speak at Foundation events about business development concepts for women considering entrepreneurship. His involvement remained appropriately secondary. This was clearly my project, not ours, but his respect for the work was evident. "What you're building through the Foundation matters, Ellie," he commented after attending a graduation ceremony. "For program participants, you can see it in their faces, that shift from fear to empowerment. It's remarkable." His observation captured the essence of what made the work meaningful to me. Having experienced my own journey from financial dependency to autonomy, I understood viscerally the freedom that came with such knowledge. While my circumstances had been privileged in many ways, I had never faced true financial hardship, had educational advantages many women lacked. The emotional trajectory from vulnerability to confidence was one I recognized intimately. As summer progressed, we finalized plans for our European trip, 2 weeks divided between London with Claire and the Italian coast. The collaborative planning process reflected our evolved relationship, with each of us contributing preferences and accommodating the other's priorities. Richard wanted to explore historical sites. I was more interested in local cultural experiences. We built an itinerary that balanced both, scheduling some activities together and others separately. "This feels different," Richard observed as we reviewed our finalized plans one evening. "Usually I would have just handed you an itinerary and expected you to fill in around the edges." "And I would have accepted that arrangement without question," I added, recognizing my own role in our previous dynamic. "I think we're getting better at this partnership concept." The trip itself proved revelatory in unexpected ways. In London, Claire watched our interactions with cautious optimism, noting the changes in both her father's behavior and my willingness to express preferences and disagreements openly. "You're actually talking to each other," she commented during a private moment while Richard was settling the bill at dinner. "Like, really communicating, not just performing roles or avoiding conflict." "We're trying," I acknowledged. "It's not perfect, but it's authentic in a way we've never been before." Claire studied me thoughtfully. "You know what's most noticeable? You laugh more now. Real laughter, not that polite social chuckle you used to do at Dad's business functions." Her observation surprised me, though I recognized its accuracy. "I suppose I do. I hadn't really noticed." "I have," she said simply. "It suits you." In Italy, away from familiar routines and professional responsibilities, Richard and I discovered new aspects of each other and ourselves. I found unexpected pleasure in early morning swims in the Mediterranean, something I would have considered too indulgent in previous years. Richard, freed from corporate attire and expectations, revealed a playful side rarely displayed during our marriage, joining local fishermen for pre-dawn expeditions, haggling good-naturedly in village markets, attempting increasingly ridiculous Italian phrases that left waiters simultaneously confused and amused. One evening, as we lingered over dinner at a small cliffside restaurant in Positano, Richard raised a question that caught me off guard. "If you could go back and change one decision in your life, what would it be?" The query wasn't accusatory or melancholy, simply curious. I considered it carefully, watching fishing boats returning to harbor in the distance. "That's difficult," I said finally. The obvious answer might be starting my financial independence earlier, or pursuing my own career more assertively. But those changes would have created a different life altogether. Perhaps one without Claire and Adam as they are now, or without other experiences that shaped me in important ways. I took a sip of wine before continuing. "I think what I would change isn't a single decision, but an approach. I would have insisted on being seen and heard from the beginning. on maintaining my identity rather than gradually sublimating it into supporting roles. Richard nodded thoughtfully. That's a nuanced answer, not rejecting the life we built, but approaching it differently. What about you? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. What would you change? He didn't hesitate. I would have been brave enough to be vulnerable with you, to show you my insecurities and fears instead of hiding behind achievement and control. Maybe if I had, we wouldn't have grown so far apart without realizing it. His answer surprised me with its emotional honesty, something the Richard of 2 years ago would have carefully avoided, particularly in a public setting. We sat with these reflections as twilight deepened around us, neither rushing to fill the contemplative silence that followed. Later that night, walking back to our rented villa along moonlit streets, Richard took my hand, not possessively as he might have once done, but as a gesture of connection between equals. I found myself accepting the contact comfortably, our fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "Thank you for this," he said quietly as we reached our destination. Not just the trip, but the chance to build something new together. I know it wasn't guaranteed, especially after what happened. It still isn't guaranteed, I reminded him gently. We're choosing this partnership one day at a time, based on how we show up for each other now, not on what we once promised. I understand that, he assured me. And I find I prefer it this way, earned rather than assumed. More meaningful for being deliberately chosen. His words captured something essential about our reconstructed relationship. What we had now wasn't the unquestioning merger of identities that characterized our early marriage, nor was it the polite distance of our later years together. It was something more intentional, a genuine partnership between two whole individuals who chose connection while maintaining separate identities. Returning to Chicago after 3 weeks abroad, we slipped back into established routines with a renewed appreciation for our evolving bond. My Matthews Tech responsibilities continued alongside foundation work. Richard balanced innovation leadership with mentoring young engineers. We maintained our carefully negotiated balance of togetherness and independence, sharing meals and meaningful conversations while preserving space for individual interests and friendships. In September, as Chicago summer faded into early autumn, Melissa Davis unexpectedly re-entered our awareness, not directly, but through industry news. The technology startup she had launched after leaving Matthews Tech had secured significant venture capital funding, positioning her as an emerging leader in marketing analytics. Her name appeared in business publications and industry websites, impossible to miss for those of us who followed the sector closely. "Have you seen this?" Richard asked one morning, sliding a business journal across the breakfast table. Melissa's photograph accompanied a feature article on 10 innovators, reshaping marketing technology. I scanned the piece quickly, noting the professional accomplishments described without mentioning any connection to Matthews Tech or Richard personally. "Good for her," I said honestly. "The technology looks promising." Richard studied me carefully, perhaps expecting jealousy or resentment. Finding none, he seemed both relieved and slightly puzzled. "You're genuinely not bothered by her success?" I considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, I might have been, when her existence represented everything I had sacrificed and everything you had betrayed. Now, she's just another entrepreneur in a competitive industry. Her success or failure has no bearing on my life or self-worth. Richard absorbed this, nodding slowly. "That's remarkably healthy, Ellie." "It's freedom," I corrected gently. "Freedom from measuring myself against others or defining my value through relationships. Something I've worked hard to achieve. And something I'm still learning," he acknowledged. "Seeing her name still triggers shame for me. Not because I want what we had, but because it represents how thoroughly I betrayed my own values along with your trust." His honesty about these complex emotions reflected the progress he had made in therapy. learning, to articulate feelings rather than burying them beneath corporate polish or emotional distance. 2 years earlier, he would have deflected with humor or changed the subject entirely rather than admitting such vulnerability. Shame can be instructive if we don't get stuck in it, I offered, drawing on insights from my own therapeutic journey. It reminds us of values we hold important, even when we've failed to live up to them. He smiled slightly. That's very generous, Ellie. I'm not sure I would be as philosophical if our situations were reversed. You might surprise yourself, I suggested. Growth often emerges from places we least expect it. The conversation shifted to other topics: an upcoming board meeting, weekend plans with friends, Adam's recent promotion at the hospital. But the brief exchange about Melissa highlighted how far we had both traveled from the people we had been when the affair had come to light. The revelation that had once threatened to destroy everything had ultimately catalyzed growth neither of us could have anticipated. As autumn deepened toward winter, I found myself reflecting on the approaching 2-year mark since the anniversary party that had changed everything. The conventional wisdom about recovering from infidelity suggested that 2 years represented a significant milestone, the point at which most couples either had fully reconciled or definitively separated. Our path had been neither straightforward nor conventional, evolving through careful negotiation rather than emotional impulse. I've been thinking about timeframes, I mentioned to Dr. Mendez during one of our now monthly couples sessions. How healing and transformation aren't linear processes with predictable timelines. They rarely are, she agreed, especially with relationships as established as yours. You're not just healing from a discrete incident, but reconstructing patterns established over decades. That's complex, nuanced work that doesn't follow convenient schedules. Yet we tend to impose these artificial markers, Richard observed. 2 years to recover from infidelity, 1 year to grieve a loss, 6 months to adjust to retirement, as if human emotions operate on standardized timetables. Dr. Mendez smiled approvingly at his insight. Exactly. Which is why I've been so impressed with your willingness to allow this process to unfold organically, to focus on quality of connection rather than reaching some predetermined, recovered state by an arbitrary deadline. Her validation of our approach was reassuring. The path we had chosen, methodical, deliberate reconstruction rather than either immediate reconciliation or clean separation, had sometimes felt isolating. Friends and family often seemed confused by our ambiguous status, expecting clearer resolution after such a significant betrayal. People want narrative closure, I noted. They find it unsettling when relationships exist in transitional spaces for extended periods. Yet that's where the most meaningful growth often happens, Dr. Mendez pointed out, in those liminal spaces between what was and what might be. As we approached the holiday season, this liminality felt increasingly comfortable, even preferable, to the false certainty of our previous marriage. The Christmas plans we made reflected our evolved approach. Some traditions maintained, others discarded, new elements introduced that honored our individual preferences alongside shared experiences. We hosted Christmas Eve dinner for Claire and Adam along with their partners, a gathering that felt both familiar and distinctly different from previous years. Instead of my executing an elaborate meal while Richard entertained guests, we prepared the celebration together, each contributing dishes and details that mattered to us individually. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on professional achievements and personal reflections without the carefully maintained surface politeness that had characterized family gatherings in the past. After dinner, as we relaxed in the living room with wine and dessert, Claire raised her glass in an impromptu toast. To transformation, she said, her gaze moving between Richard and me. And to the courage it requires. To transformation, we echoed, the simple words capturing the essence of our journey over the past 2 years. Later that night, after our children had departed and we were preparing for bed, Richard paused by the bedroom window looking out at snow beginning to fall softly over the garden. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't discovered the affair when you did?" he asked quietly. "If things had continued as they were?" The question was hypothetical, but weighty, inviting honest reflection rather than reassurance. I considered it carefully before responding. "I think we would have continued our parallel lives indefinitely," I said finally. "You seeking validation through achievement and external relationships, me gradually disappearing further into supporting roles until there was little left of my authentic self. Not a crisis, perhaps, but a slow diminishment that might have been even more tragic in its way." Richard nodded slowly, still watching the snow. "I think you're right. It's strange to consider that something so painful could ultimately lead to something healthier than what we had before." "Strange but true," I agreed, joining him at the window. "Though I wouldn't recommend infidelity as a growth strategy." The wry comment surprised a genuine laugh from both of us, the kind of authentic humor that had been absent from our relationship for years before the crisis. Standing together, watching snow transform the familiar landscape into something new and beautiful, I felt a profound gratitude, not for the betrayal that had catalyzed our journey, but for the courage we had both found to use that catalyst for genuine transformation rather than either superficial reconciliation or reflexive separation. "Merry Christmas, Ellie," Richard said softly, his arm gently encircling my waist with a touch that asked rather than assumed permission. "Merry Christmas, Richard," I replied, leaning slightly into the contact, a choice rather than an obligation, or habit. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the garden in a pristine blanket that concealed its familiar contours while revealing new patterns in the transformed landscape. Much like our relationship, I reflected, recognizable in its fundamental structure, but renewed in ways that allowed authentic beauty to emerge where stagnation had once prevailed. The year ahead would bring its own challenges and discoveries, its own moments of connection and necessary distance. But standing there in comfortable silence with the man I had chosen anew, not from obligation or fear, but from clear-eyed understanding of both his flaws and genuine growth, I felt a quiet certainty. Whatever came next, I would meet it as my full, authentic self. No longer invisible, no longer secondary, no longer measuring my worth through others' achievement or approval. In that knowledge lay a peace more profound than any I had known in decades of marriage before the painful awakening that had ultimately led to this moment of genuine presence. Not perfection, not fairy tale romance, but something more valuable. Authentic connection between equals, deliberately chosen and mindfully maintained. Snow fell, transforming the world outside our window. And inside, in the quiet space between us, transformation continued as well. Unhurried, intentional, and ultimately more beautiful than either of us could have imagined when crisis first forced us to see ourselves and each other clearly, for perhaps the first time in our shared journey. 3 years to the day after my revelation at our anniversary party, I stood at the podium in the university auditorium, preparing to address the graduating class of my alma mater. The invitation to deliver the commencement speech had come as a surprise, a recognition not of my business success or foundation work, but of the journey itself. Your story of reinvention at an age when many are settling into comfortable routines has resonated deeply, the university president had written. Our students would benefit tremendously from hearing about your path. Looking out at the sea of young faces, most in their 20s, their lives still unwritten, I felt a moment of doubt. What wisdom could I possibly offer from my specific experience that would translate to their generation, their circumstances, their future challenges? But then I spotted Richard in the audience, sitting beside Claire and Adam, all three watching with unmistakable pride. The sight centered me, reminding me that authentic stories transcend specific details to touch universal truths. Distinguished faculty, honored guests, and especially graduates, I began, my voice steady in the microphone. Conventional wisdom suggests I should offer you advice about your careers, your futures, your ambitions. But today, I want to speak about something more fundamental: the courage to remain visible in your own life. The phrase had emerged during a therapy session years earlier, but had become central to my understanding of both my past choices and future intentions. I continued, sharing not the specific details of Richard's affair or my corporate takeover, but the broader truth of how easily we can disappear within our own narratives, becoming supporting characters rather than protagonists in our own stories. Society offers endless templates for how we should live, love, work, and measure success, I told them. These templates aren't inherently wrong, but they become dangerous when accepted without question, when we contort ourselves to fit predetermined roles rather than creating authentic lives that honor our unique gifts and needs. I spoke about the subtle ways this disappearing act happens, how we might wake up decades into adulthood and realize we've been living according to others' expectations rather than our own truth. How success by external metrics can mask profound internal emptiness. How relationships based on performance rather than authenticity inevitably create distance, even when we share the same physical space. The conventional narrative suggests that major life revelations belong to youth, I noted. That by your 30s, you should have yourself figured out. By your 40s, your path established. By your 60s, your story essentially complete. I'm here to tell you that transformation remains possible at every stage, that it's never too late to reclaim your visibility, your voice, your authentic presence in your own life. As I concluded, I offered the insight that had become my guiding principle. The most profound ownership isn't of assets or achievements, but of your own authentic voice. Guard it carefully, exercise it regularly, and when you find you've lost connection with it, whether through others' expectations or your own accommodations, have the courage to reclaim it, regardless of how uncomfortable or disruptive that reclamation might initially appear. The applause that followed felt different from the polite acknowledgement I'd received at countless business functions over the decades. It held a warmth, an engagement that suggested my words had found resonance beyond mere appreciation of a well-delivered speech. Afterward, as we gathered for a celebration lunch at Claire's favorite restaurant, my daughter offered the highest praise I could imagine. "You didn't sound like you were giving a speech, Mom. You sounded like you were sharing something real, something true." "It was true," I confirmed. "Perhaps the truest thing I've ever said publicly." Richard, who had watched the address with visible emotion, added his own observation. "What struck me was how completely you've integrated this wisdom. You're not just speaking about authenticity, you're embodying it in every aspect of your life now." His words captured something essential about these past 3 years. The initial crisis that had forced me to reclaim my voice had evolved into a sustained practice of authenticity that now permeated every dimension of my existence: professional, personal, and internal. The Eleanor Matthews Foundation had expanded beyond Chicago to establish programs in 5 additional cities, with plans for national expansion through partnerships with community organizations serving women in transition. My role had evolved from founder to strategic visionary, with a talented executive director handling day-to-day operations. This structure allowed me to focus on program development and relationship building with key partners while maintaining balance in my personal life. At Matthews Tech, the leadership transition had fully stabilized. Cynthia Okafor had proven an exceptional CEO, bringing fresh energy and perspective that complemented the company's established strengths. My role as board chair remained active but appropriately bounded, allowing me to contribute strategic oversight without becoming consumed by operational details. Richard continued thriving in his innovation-focused role, developing new technologies that kept Matthews Tech at the industry's forefront. We had found an unexpected gift in our professional reconfiguration: the ability to appreciate each other's business acumen without the complications of direct reporting relationships or unequal power dynamics. We occasionally sought each other's counsel on work challenges, but maintained clear boundaries between our professional and personal interactions. Our relationship had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. The relationship contract we had established through therapy had evolved from formal document to internalized understanding, with regular check-ins to ensure continued alignment. We had learned to communicate directly about needs and boundaries rather than relying on assumptions or accommodations. We had discovered how to support each other's growth without sacrificing our individual identities or interests. You know, what surprises me most? Richard reflected as we walked along the lakeshore after the graduation celebration. How much more I enjoy our relationship now that it's based on choice rather than obligation or habit. There's something profoundly freeing about knowing we're together because we genuinely want to be, not because it's expected or convenient. His observation resonated with my own experience. I was thinking something similar during the commencement ceremony today, I admitted. How different it felt to have you there as my chosen partner, rather than as an obligatory presence. The support feels more authentic somehow. Because it is, he replied simply. I'm not performing the role of supportive husband according to some societal script. I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished and who you've become. These moments of mutual recognition, of appreciating how far we had traveled from our former selves and relationship patterns, had become increasingly common. Neither of us took for granted the transformation we had achieved, individually and together. We remained conscious that maintaining this healthier dynamic required ongoing attention and intention rather than autopilot functioning. As we continued our walk, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 3 years earlier, discovering Richard's affair with Melissa had felt like the end of everything, a devastating betrayal that shattered the foundation of our shared life. In many ways, it had been an ending, of illusions, of unconscious patterns, of a marriage built on performance rather than authentic connection. But from that ending had emerged beginnings I could never have anticipated. My emergence as a corporate leader, the foundation's impact on women's financial empowerment, and most surprisingly, a relationship with Richard that contained more genuine intimacy than we had experienced in decades of conventional marriage. What are you thinking about? Richard asked, noticing my contemplative silence. How life rarely unfolds as we expect, I replied honestly. 3 years ago, if someone had described where we'd be today, I would have considered it impossible. Yet here we are, in a relationship that's healthier and more authentic than anything we managed to create in our first 3 decades together. Here we are indeed, he agreed, taking my hand as we watched the sunset paint Lake Michigan in shades of gold and pink. Though I suspect we had to become different people to create this different relationship. His insight captured something essential about our journey. The Eleanor and Richard who had attended that fateful anniversary party 3 years earlier could never have built what we now shared. We had each needed to reclaim our authentic selves, me emerging from invisibility, him from performance, before genuine partnership became possible. As darkness settled over the water, we turned toward home, walking in comfortable silence. The path ahead would undoubtedly hold challenges and adjustments as we continued aging together. But the foundation we had rebuilt, based on authentic presence rather than prescribed roles, provided stability that our seemingly perfect former marriage had always lacked. What I knew with certainty was this: whatever came next, I would face it as my full, authentic self, visible, voiced, and valued not for what I provided to others, but for who I fundamentally was. The ownership I had claimed was not primarily of Matthew's tech, significant as that had been, but of my own narrative, my right to determine how my story would unfold, rather than accepting the limited role others had expected me to play. In reclaiming that fundamental ownership, I had discovered freedom more profound than any corporate acquisition could provide: the freedom to live deliberately, to love authentically, and to leave a legacy defined not by accommodation, but by courage. Standing at the podium earlier that day, addressing graduates about to embark on their own journeys, I had shared the wisdom hard-won through my unexpected midlife transformation, that it's never too late to become visible in your own life. Walking home beside the man who had witnessed both my disappearance and emergence, I felt the truth of those words resonating in every deliberate step toward the future we were consciously creating together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.